I was standing in the ICU beside my wife's bed, listening to the cold hiss of the ventilator keeping her alive. I called my daughter, begging her to come to the hospital. Her answer was simple: "I'm busy. Don't make a big deal out of it." So I said only one word: "All right." In that moment, I understood something I had never wanted to believe: my own daughter had betrayed me. The next day, I signed one document and cut her out of my life. After that came 42 missed calls. I ignored every one of them. Before I reveal what happened after those 42 missed calls, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what the weather is like in your city right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow this journey. Please note this story contains dramatized elements created to deepen the emotional impact. The sharp smell of hospital disinfectant usually signals cleanliness, but at exactly 9:47 p.m. in the Charlotte General ICU, it smelled more like the aftermath of a slow-motion car crash, the quiet collapse of a 40-year marriage. I sat there, Douglas Harrow, 65 years old, and newly retired from a lifetime of inspecting bridges, staring at the heavy double doors that had swallowed my wife only minutes earlier. For 4 decades, I had made a career of spotting danger before anyone else could see it: rust creeping through steel beams, hairline fractures, hiding inside concrete supports. My job was to find weakness before gravity and time finished the job. Yet somehow I had never once turned that same flashlight toward the foundation of my own life. My hands rested uselessly in my lap, heavy as stone. Rose had been driving down Highway 74, a road we had traveled together thousands of times over the years, when the brakes on her sedan simply stopped existing. That was the phrase the police officer used. The brakes didn't fail gradually. They were just gone. The surgeons called it a miracle that she survived the impact at all. But sitting there listening to the steady mechanical hiss of the ventilator through the ICU wall, all I could feel was guilt, deep, hollow, and relentless. I should have been the one in that car. I should have heard the warning squeal of worn brake pads, or noticed the softness in the pedal weeks earlier. I should have been paying attention. Instead, while my wife was hurtling toward a concrete pylon at 60 miles an hour, I had been standing in a hardware store parking lot loading bags of mulch into the trunk of my truck. For a man who spent 40 years predicting structural failure, this was the one collapse I should have seen coming. But the mechanical disaster wasn't the only thing gnawing at me that night. There was another silence, colder and far more disturbing. The silence from my own daughter. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. Lillian Harrow Shepherd, 34 years old, owner of a thriving interior design firm, a woman who practically lived with her phone glued to her hand, had vanished into complete silence, while her mother was lying on an operating table with her skull open. She had chosen not to come. Have you ever felt a bridge suddenly give way beneath your feet? The fall itself isn't what breaks you. It's the instant you realize that the structure you trusted your entire weight on was already hollow. I pressed the call button again for the 4th time. My thumb trembled against the screen. This time the line connected. But instead of panic or concern, I heard the muffled noise of music and laughter somewhere in the background. Then a long, irritated sigh. "Dad, I told you I'm exhausted," Lillian said, her voice cold and flat. "I'm in the middle of something important, and I really don't need this drama tonight. I'll check in tomorrow if I have time. Good night." Before I could tell her that Rose might not live long enough to see tomorrow morning, the line went dead. I stared down at the dark screen, a hard knot of betrayal forming in my stomach, something no surgeon in this hospital could remove. A few minutes later, Nurse Joyce approached with a clipboard in her hands. Her tired eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent decades delivering bad news. "Mr. Harrow," she said gently, "I'm very sorry, but we need to process the $15,000 deposit for the neuro-rehabilitation transfer." I nodded automatically and reached for my wallet. My primary credit card slid into the payment machine. Declined. The word appeared on the small screen like a verdict. Confused, I tried my backup card. Declined. That's impossible, I said, my voice beginning to crack. There's more than 50,000 available on that line alone. I looked from the nurse's sympathetic expression back down at my phone, and a far more terrifying question finally formed in my mind. If my credit had vanished overnight, then where had the $300,000 in our retirement savings gone? The buzzing in my ears swallowed the hospital intercom announcements, a thin, piercing whine that sounded eerily similar to the sirens racing down Highway 74 only 6 hours earlier. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, my thumb slipping across the screen while I tried to log into my bank app. Nurse Joyce stood beside me, her expression gentle but heavy, with the kind of quiet sympathy that nurses develop after witnessing too many lives fracture in a single night. The $300,000 retirement fund should have been there. It was supposed to be the bedrock beneath everything Rose and I had built over 40 years, our safety, our future, the quiet years we had promised each other. But the loading icon on the screen kept spinning cold and indifferent, as if mocking my desperation. My thoughts began unraveling, drifting backward through the hours to the moment when the first crack appeared in the foundation of that night. I had been sitting in my home office earlier that afternoon, finishing a safety report for the Catawba River Bridge. The numbers lined up perfectly, the calculations clean and reassuring. Then the phone rang. Mr. Harrow. The voice belonged to a state trooper, calm, clipped professional. There has been an accident. Highway 74 near the overpass. He described a violent single-vehicle crash involving a silver sedan. My lungs seemed to empty all at once. Is she alive? I managed to ask, gripping the edge of my desk while the room tilted around me. The officer explained that Rose had been airlifted to Charlotte General. He mentioned what they believed to be a brake failure that had sent her car straight through the guardrail. Memory rarely returns in neat chronological order. It comes back in fragments, sensations more than scenes. I remember the smell of scorched rubber in the air and the metallic taste of adrenaline settling in the back of my throat. During the drive to the hospital, I passed the crash site just as emergency vehicles still surrounded the wreckage. Red and blue lights flickered across the asphalt like warning beacons. As a bridge inspector, I've spent my entire career reading the physical evidence of collapse. Even at 40 miles an hour, my eyes instinctively studied the scene. The debris field stretched too far. The guardrail was bent outward at an unnatural angle, and the skid marks that should have been there weren't. Steel doesn't twist like that if a driver has even a second to slow down. Something about the story didn't line up. Just 3 days earlier, I had handed Lillian $2,000 in cash. Rose had mentioned that the sedan's brakes were squealing, and I asked Lillian to take the car to the mechanic she always used while I was out inspecting a bridge site. That evening, she called me, her voice breezy and confident. All fixed, she said. New pads, new rotors. The car's good as new. But the asphalt at the crash site told a different story. There had been no braking, no attempt to slow. Do you know what it feels like to realize you may have handed a wolf the keys to your own sheepfold? The realization doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack in concrete. When I finally rushed through the emergency room doors, I found Rose Harrow lying motionless beneath a sheet of pale blue hospital fabric. She was 63 years old, a retired librarian, who believed life followed a kind of quiet order like books arranged neatly within the Dewey Decimal System. Now her life was being measured by the jagged rhythm of a heart monitor. A neurosurgeon named Dr. Leandros stepped out from the trauma bay. His face was sharp and controlled, but there was fresh blood on his scrubs. She has a massive subdural hematoma, Douglas, he told me quietly. We're taking her into surgery immediately. I stood frozen as orderlies began wheeling her gurney toward the elevators. Instinctively, I reached for her handbag so it wouldn't be left behind. As I lifted it, something inside the side pocket vibrated. Her phone. I pulled it out, my vision blurring as the screen lit up. A message from Lillian had arrived just 1 hour before the crash. "Don't worry about the car, Mom. It's safe now." I stared at the words while the elevator doors slowly closed with a soft, mechanical hiss. "It's safe now." The phrase echoed in my head as the elevator carried my wife away toward the operating room. Safe. Or silenced. My hands began to tremble, and it wasn't because of the cold hospital air. Grief is supposed to feel heavy, like a weight pressing down on your chest. But betrayal is different. Betrayal is cold, so cold, it settles in your bones and makes your teeth ache, even in a room that is already chilled by hospital air. I stood in the ICU hallway, holding Rose's phone, as if it were the last fragile thread connecting me to the woman fighting for her life behind those thick steel doors. The surgeons were somewhere beyond them, trying to stitch together what the crash had shattered. My hands trembled not from the air conditioning, but from the message glowing on the screen. Safe. The word felt sharp and wrong, like a piece of broken metal lodged in my throat. I stared at it again, my thumb hovering over Lillian's contact. I needed to hear her voice. I needed her to explain why she had told us the brakes were repaired when the highway showed no sign that they had ever existed at all. I tapped the call button, but before the line could connect, another message flashed across the screen. "I am currently unavailable. Please contact my assistant for scheduling." It was an automated do not disturb response. My own daughter had placed a digital wall between us while her mother lay unconscious on an operating table. Even Rose's phone had been filtered out of Lillian's life. I kept calling anyway. Once, twice, 5 times, 10. The automated response kept returning like a locked gate. It was almost 11 when the system finally broke and the call forced its way through. When Lillian answered, there was no panic, no tremor of fear. Only irritation. "Dad?" "I told you," she said sharply. "I have a designer showcase at 8 in the morning. I've had a long day already, and I can't sacrifice my sleep over this overdramatic situation. It's not my problem right now. Good night." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The silence that followed was so deep I could hear the distant whir of floor polishers somewhere down the corridor. "Lillian," I finally whispered. "She's your mother. She has bleeding in her brain." But the line had already gone dead. Have you ever sat in a crowded building and still felt like the only human left alive? That kind of silence doesn't feel empty. It roars. By 2 in the morning, the surgeon finally emerged from the operating wing. "Rose was alive," he said, but she was comatose. Stable but fragile. I sank into a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, trying to slow the tremor in my breathing. "Just one more bridge to cross, Addie," I murmured to the empty room. "We have the money. We're safe." I needed to believe that. I needed to believe the 40 years of savings sitting in our retirement account could carry us through this storm. I opened the banking app again to figure out why my cards had been declined. The screen glowed pale blue in the dark waiting room. The loading circle spun slowly, draining away my patience. Then the numbers appeared. The retirement account, our bedrock, showed $8,100. I refreshed the page. Then again. The investment accounts were empty lines. The checking account barely held $3,000. My pulse pounded in my ears as I opened the transaction history. One transfer stood out immediately. A massive withdrawal made at 9 p.m. tonight, while I had been begging doctors to save my wife's life. The recipient name froze my blood. Harrow Shepherd Designs. My daughter hadn't simply abandoned us. She had started stripping the house bare while we were still inside it. I watched the pale light of dawn slowly stretch across the hospital's linoleum floor, creeping forward like a thin sheet of water spreading across cold concrete. Each passing minute felt deliberate, measured. I was counting down to 8 in the morning, the hour when the ghosts haunting my bank account would finally have to answer for themselves. The air inside the hospital felt thinner now. The numb shield of shock had faded, leaving everything sharp and painfully clear. My daughter hadn't simply ignored us during the worst night of our lives. She had methodically dismantled the very structure of the life Rose and I had spent 40 years building. At exactly 8:15 a.m., my phone vibrated in my hand. An unknown number. I answered immediately. "Mr. Harrow," a calm voice asked. Her name was Maria. She introduced herself as a senior fraud investigator from the bank's headquarters. Her voice carried the quiet precision of someone accustomed to delivering difficult financial truths. "Mr. Harrow," she said carefully. "Our systems flagged a series of wire transfers linked to your account over the past 18 months. 18 months. The number struck me like a dull hammer. Maria continued, each sentence measured and controlled. These transactions were authorized through a durable power of attorney that was submitted in August of last year. A cold sweat spread across the back of my neck. "August," I whispered. "I haven't even gone to the bank with my daughter in at least 3 years. There was a brief pause before Maria spoke again. "The records show that the email associated with your account was changed approximately 18 months ago." She read the address aloud. harrow.records@gmail.com. I had never seen it before. Suddenly, the silence made sense. No alerts, no transaction notifications, no warnings. The entire digital trail had been quietly redirected, while hundreds of thousands of dollars were siphoned away. "She didn't just move the money," I murmured, leaning against the cold hospital wall as nausea rolled through my stomach. "She took my name." While we were speaking, Maria emailed me a copy of the document that authorized everything. The power of attorney. My phone vibrated again as the file arrived. I opened it slowly, my hands unsteady as I scrolled through the pages. My name appeared clearly on the first page. My home address, my banking information, and at the bottom of the final page, my signature, or something that looked almost identical to it. Except it was too clean, too steady. In the last few years, my handwriting had developed a faint tremor, the kind that comes quietly with age. This signature had none of it. A forged signature is like a hairline fracture inside a bridge beam. To most people, it looks flawless. To someone trained to inspect structure, it sounds like the beginning of collapse. Whoever forged it had practiced. Repeatedly. It wasn't careless. It was meticulous. My thoughts were interrupted by the approach of a young surgical resident. His badge read, "Doctor." Aris and his white coat still carried the crisp lines of someone who had not yet spent decades watching families fall apart inside hospital corridors. "Mr. Harrow," he said gently, holding a clipboard. "We need to discuss the transfer to the neurorehabilitation facility." I nodded slowly. "The specialized center requires a $15,000 deposit to secure a bed," he continued. $15,000. Rose's recovery, her chance to learn how to walk again, speak again, maybe even remember me now, depended on money that had vanished overnight. Money taken by my own daughter. How do you explain that to a doctor? How do you say the person who stole your life savings is the same person who shares your last name? I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. "I'm experiencing some complications with my accounts," I told him quietly. "Please give me until this afternoon to coordinate the wire transfer." The lie tasted like ash. "Doctor." Aris studied my face for a moment, concern flickering briefly in his eyes, but he nodded and stepped back toward the ICU doors. As he walked away, my phone chimed again, a notification from the hospital's security gate application. Rose had insisted on installing it at home after a break-in in our neighborhood years ago. It sent alerts whenever a registered vehicle entered a monitored parking area. The message was brief. "Vehicle detected, white Tesla. VIP parking lot. My stomach tightened. That Tesla had been purchased 6 months ago, with money from my retirement account. Lillian was here, and she had arrived driving the car that my future had paid for. Across the hallway, the elevator display lit up. The numbers began climbing slowly. 1, 2, 3. Each soft mechanical chime echoed through the quiet corridor as the elevator rose toward the ICU floor. Toward me. The elevator doors didn't simply open. They parted with a soft metallic hiss that reminded me of a predator drawing breath before the strike. The display above them flickered dark as my daughter stepped out into the ICU waiting area, wrapped in what looked like $3,000 of Italian wool. Her heels struck the linoleum floor with a precise rhythm, sharp, deliberate clicks that echoed through the hallway like a hammer tapping nails into wood. Lillian Harrow Shepherd did not look for me right away. Instead, she paused beside the glass partition that separated the waiting area from the nurse's station. She tilted her chin, slightly studying her reflection, as if the hospital corridor were nothing more than a dressing room mirror. Her fingers smoothed the edge of her hair, checking every strand. She looked flawless. In her hand was a designer coffee cup, the rich aroma of roasted beans and expensive cream drifting through the sterile hallway. The scent clashed violently with the sharp chemical smell of disinfectant and the quiet desperation that hung over the ICU like fog. When she finally turned toward me, she walked over with controlled ease and offered a brief hug. It wasn't warm. It felt transactional, something polite people do when a greeting requires physical contact. God, this place is depressing, Dad, she said as she pulled back, brushing invisible dust from the sleeve of her coat. How do you tolerate this lighting? It's doing absolutely terrible things to everyone's skin. I stared at her, my daughter. Yet in that moment she felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Your mother is in a coma, Lillian, I said quietly. My voice sounded rough, like gravel being crushed beneath a boot. The lighting is the least of our problems. I guided her a few steps away from the nurse's station, toward a quieter corner of the hallway. My fingers twitched with a slow, controlled anger I could barely keep contained. I checked the bank accounts this morning, I said, lowering my voice so only she could hear. I saw the transfers. Harrow Shepherd Designs now holds our entire retirement fund. Her expression didn't change. I have $15,000 due this afternoon for your mother's neuro-rehabilitation transfer, I continued. I need that money returned immediately. I studied her eyes carefully. I searched for any sign of the daughter I had raised, some flicker of guilt, hesitation, or fear. There was none. Only irritation. Not my problem. She spoke the words slowly, each syllable landing like a hammer blow. 3 words. 3 words that dismantled 34 years of fatherhood in a single breath. I told you last night, she continued coolly. My company has overhead payroll obligations and a major expansion happening in the South End. My liquidity is extremely tight right now. Whatever financial mismanagement you've created is not my responsibility. My breath caught in my throat. She had just revealed something without realizing it. She knew the exact amount required for the rehab deposit before I had finished explaining. She was monitoring the hospital's billing system, watching, listening, tracking every financial move through the digital cracks she had created with that forged power of attorney. At what point does a child stop being a daughter and become something else entirely? Does it happen when the love disappears, or when the bank balance reaches 6 figures? Lillian glanced down at the gold watch on her wrist, the same one I had given her for her 30th birthday, and sighed impatiently. I have a tasting appointment with a client in 20 minutes, she said. Please don't be so dramatic. If Mom is meant to wake up, she will. There's no point throwing good money after bad until we know. Good money after bad. The phrase echoed through my mind, like a cracked beam snapping under pressure. Call me if anything permanent happens, she added casually. Then she turned and began walking back toward the elevators. As she moved away, the side of her designer tote bag shifted open slightly. Inside, a blue legal folder slipped into view. The bold heading was impossible to miss. Petition for involuntary guardianship. Beneath it, printed in sharp black letters, was my name, Douglas Harrow. For a moment, I stood frozen. Through the window, I later watched the white Tesla glide out of the hospital parking lot, sunlight flashing across its polished hood. But my attention remained locked on the memory of that blue folder. In that instant, I understood the final piece of her plan. Lillian wasn't just waiting for her mother to die. She was already preparing the paperwork to bury me alive, locked inside a state-run facility, stripped of every decision, every asset, every fragment of the life I had spent 40 years. My fingers were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my phone onto the concrete. It was the last piece of technology I still owned that hadn't somehow been touched or redirected by my own daughter. I sat on a cold stone bench just outside the hospital entrance, the evening shadows stretching across the pavement like long, reaching fingers. The air had turned cool, but I barely noticed it. My chest felt tight, as if every breath had to fight its way out. Every time I blinked, I saw that blue folder again. Petition for involuntary guardianship. The words echoed through my head like a verdict. For a man who had spent his entire life standing on his own 2 feet, guardianship wasn't simply paperwork. It was a slow burial while you were still alive. It meant losing the right to control your own money, your own decisions, even your own freedom. I scrolled through the contacts on my phone, passing names of neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances who would offer sympathy but nothing more. Finally, my thumb stopped on a name that had been there for 4 decades. Basil. When the line connected, my voice cracked in the cold air. She took it all, I whispered. Every dollar. She took everything, Basil. And now she's just waiting for Rose to die. The words tumbled out of me in broken fragments. I told him about the declined credit cards, the empty accounts, and the cold indifference in Lillian's eyes when she said the money was no longer my problem. Basil Redmond arrived 20 minutes later. He was 72 now, but he still carried himself like the hardware store owner who had built his business with stubborn determination and a pair of strong hands. He stepped out of his truck, holding a dented thermos of black coffee and a thick envelope tucked beneath his arm. When he gripped my shoulder, his handshake felt exactly the same as it had 40 years ago, solid, steady, dependable. He didn't waste time offering comforting cliches. Basil had never been that kind of man. Instead, he sat beside me on the bench and looked straight into my eyes. "Stay right there, Douglas," he had told me earlier on the phone. "Don't say another word to her. I'm 20 minutes away." He had also said something else that made the hair on my arms stand upright. 3 weeks earlier, he had seen Beckett Shepard lingering near my house late at night. Long before the crash. Long before the hospital. This hadn't started yesterday. It had been building quietly in the background, like a slow-moving invasion. Do you have that one friend in life who doesn't tell you everything will be fine? The one who hands you the shovel instead and says, "Start digging." That was Basil. He guided me inside the hospital cafeteria, where the stale smell of burnt coffee and floor wax hung thick in the air. We sat at a small metal table near the vending machines. Without saying a word, Basil pushed a heavy envelope across the surface toward me. "This isn't a loan," he said. "It's a war chest. Go pay the nurse so they don't move Rose an inch." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were thick stacks of cash. $20,000. The weight of it seemed to pull at my chest. I had spent my entire career studying steel structures and load limits, but that envelope felt heavier than any beam I'd ever inspected. It was the weight of loyalty, the weight of a second chance. I tried to slide it back toward him. "Basil, this is your emergency fund," I said quietly. "Your floor-safe stash. I can't take that." He stared at me with the same stubborn fire he had used to run his store for 30 years. "Stop it," he snapped. "Use it." Then he leaned forward across the table, his voice dropping into a rough growl. "You've spent 40 years finding rust in steel, Douglas. Why are you letting your own daughter hide the rot inside your house?" I didn't answer. "Stop crying," he continued. "Start documenting. Every dollar, every message, every lie." He tapped the envelope with one thick finger. "Look at this the way you'd inspect a bridge. Not like a father." Then he told me something else. The night before Rose's crash, he had seen Lillian leaving my workshop, carrying a large cardboard box filled with old files. She hadn't just taken the money. She had removed the evidence. I tightened my grip around the envelope, the paper crinkling beneath my knuckles. Basil was right. I was finished being the victim in my own story. I was going home to conduct the most important structural inspection of my life. And if the evidence I suspected was truly missing, then God help Lillian. The grief was still there, a dull pressure beneath my ribs. But for the first time since the brakes failed on Highway 74, something else was beginning to rise beside it. Something sharper, something steady, something that refused to break. The porch light flickered weakly as I pushed my key into the front door lock, its uneven pulse echoing like a failing heartbeat in the house I had called home for 3 decades. I stood there for a moment, in the thick North Carolina twilight, listening to the quiet hum of summer insects and feeling the weight of Basil's envelope pressed against my ribs like a shield of armor. For 40 years, I had inspected bridges for weaknesses, corrosion in steel cracks, hidden inside concrete. But as I stepped across my own threshold that evening, a painful realization settled over me. I had failed to inspect the structure of my own life. The moment I entered the foyer, something felt wrong. The house no longer carried the gentle scent of Rose's lavender sachets, the small details she loved tucking into drawers and closets. Instead, the air held a stale heaviness, mixed with a sharp note of expensive perfume, something unfamiliar, something that didn't belong to my wife. I paused, letting my eyes move slowly through the room. Years of structural inspection had trained my mind to notice the smallest irregularities. The stack of mail on the console table had been shifted several inches from its usual place. The thin layer of dust on my antique roll-top desk had been disturbed by fingerprints smaller than mine. My voice came out in a low whisper. "What did you take?" The words seemed to dissolve into the quiet walls. I pulled out my phone and opened the home security application, hoping the cameras would reveal who had entered while I was at the hospital. Instead, the screen showed something far worse. The last 48 hours of footage had been erased. The system log revealed it had been remotely disabled from an IP address registered to Harrow Shepherd Designs on the very night Rose's car had crashed. The sanctuary of my home had already been breached. I moved down the hallway toward my office, my mind shifting into the cold, analytical mode I had relied on throughout my career. The part of me that inspected bridges was now inspecting a life. Inside the office, I walked directly to the lateral file cabinet hidden behind my shelf of structural engineering manuals. Decades earlier, I had installed a false panel inside it for important records. When I slid the cabinet open and removed the panel, a single manila folder rested inside. It wasn't supposed to be there. I opened it carefully. Inside were documents for a $95,000 home equity line of credit. For a moment, my hands stayed steady, but my stomach dropped like a collapsing beam. The signature at the bottom looked almost exactly like mine, same slant, same loops, but something about it was too perfect, too practiced. Beside it sat the official notary stamp of Marcus Webb, a name I recognized immediately from multiple contracts tied to Lillian's company. $95,000. She hadn't just emptied our savings. She had leveraged the house itself. The roof over our heads had become collateral for her ambitions. Have you ever looked at your own signature and felt as if it belonged to someone else. It's a strange kind of betrayal, like staring into a mirror and realizing the eyes looking back aren't your own. I searched deeper into the drawer. Tucked behind the loan documents were stacks of unopened bank notices and envelopes stamped "Return to Sender." They had clearly been intercepted before I ever had a chance to see them. Then I found something that made my chest tighten. Practice sheets. Dozens of them, pages filled with careful repetitions of my signature. My V, my S, every stroke and curve copied again and again. My daughter had spent hours studying the way I wrote my name, perfecting it. In that moment, the truth settled heavily over me. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She had become a ghost inside my own system, a parasite living quietly within the machinery of my life. To her, everything I had built wasn't a legacy. It was inventory. My life had become a liquidation sale. A cold clarity washed through me then, the same clarity I felt when discovering a fatal fracture in a bridge support. The point where collapse becomes inevitable. I reached toward the top shelf and pulled down an old engineering safety manual from the 1980s. As I tilted it aside, something glossy slipped free and fell onto the desk. A brochure. It belonged to a private nursing facility called Sunset Pines. Inside it was a draft letter written by Lillian. She was requesting immediate placement for 2 residents under involuntary guardianship. 2 residents. Rose and me. I turned another page in the brochure. There, printed neatly beneath the facility description, was the pricing list for the memory care unit secured wing. Locked wards, restricted access, total control. The realization chilled me. Lillian didn't just want my money. She wanted me erased. My eyes scanned the desk again, catching something I had somehow overlooked. A folder lying half-hidden beneath a stack of documents. On the tab, written in careful handwriting, were 3 simple words: Rose's policy. I didn't just open the files. I performed an autopsy on my own bank account, following the blood trail of my life savings into the cold belly of Lillian's high-end lifestyle. My hands, usually steady from a lifetime of measuring steel tolerances, only stopped shaking once the first spreadsheet loaded on my monitor. I sat there in the pale glow of the screen, mapping out 18 months of systematic extraction. It was an engineering project of greed. I found the first major puncture wound, $120,000, funneled directly toward the down payment for her Charlotte luxury condo. Another $65,000 had been paid in a lump sum to Tesla. As I pulled up her firm's promotional videos on my second monitor, I watched her glide through a kitchen with marble countertops that I now realized were carved out of my 2030 pension. Every success she had touted at our Sunday dinners, every award and expansion, had been funded by the sweat and safety checks of my entire career. I found a photo on her public design blog posted the morning of the accident. She was at a champagne brunch celebration, smiling at the camera, while I was being told the brakes had failed on Highway 74. Trying to track Lillian's greed was like trying to map a termite infestation. By the time you see the hole, the structure is already gone. I dug deeper into the digital shadows and found the ghost payroll. Beckett Shepard, my son-in-law, had been receiving consulting fees of $5,000 a month, pulled directly from my stolen equity line. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the bookkeeper for the betrayal. Every holiday gift and polite thank you card from that couple over the last year had been bought with my own hijacked labor. I whispered to the empty office, "Beckett, you spineless coward. You were on my payroll without me even knowing." The transaction history showed that his consulting fees were immediately transferred to accounts linked to underground offshore betting sites. He had a debt, and Lillian had a way to pay it, provided he kept his mouth shut about the rot. Would you look for a motive in a child's eyes, or would you just look at the receipts? I chose the receipts. They don't lie like daughters do. Then I found the fatal deadline. There was an urgent failed transfer attempt from the day before the crash. Lillian had tried to move $150,000 for a commercial lease deposit in the South End, a deal that was being rescinded in 48 hours. The bank had finally flagged it, requiring a second verbal authorization from me that she couldn't forge over a keyboard. She was racing against a clock, and Rose's life was the only obstacle between her and the final security check. The accident wasn't a tragedy. It was a desperate attempt to bypass the bank by making herself the sole beneficiary of our estate. As the printer spat out the final evidence of the $408,000 theft, my eyes drifted back to that Rose's policy folder resting on the edge of the desk. I hadn't opened it yet. I hadn't seen the forged signature that turned my wife's life into a $750,000 lottery ticket. My fingers felt like lead as I reached for the manila tab. I pulled the folder toward me, the manila cover feeling like lead, knowing that inside lay the price tag Lillian had placed on her mother's pulse. My desk lamp hummed in the midnight silence of the house, a solitary light illuminating the wreckage of a life I thought I knew. My fingers traced the edge of the paper. As I opened the Rose's policy folder, my lungs feeling as though they were filled with concrete. The first document was a change of beneficiary form for our primary $750,000 life insurance policy. It was dated November 18, 2024. I stared at the lines where my name had been systematically removed and replaced by Lillian Harrow Shepherd as the sole recipient. The notary stamp at the bottom was the same one used on the forged power of attorney. This wasn't an impulse born of a recent financial crisis. This was a year-long engineering project, a structural setup for a massive payday that required my wife to be a memory. $750,000. That's what a mother is worth to you, Lillian. I found a second secret policy beneath the first one, taken out in Rose's name without either of us ever being notified. The total value of her death was now well over $1 million. 3 weeks. That's how long she let her mother drive a ticking time bomb. Every morning she kissed her cheek and waited for the explosion. I turned my attention to a printout from a local mechanic's online portal I'd found tucked in the back. It listed an appointment for a full brake system replacement on Rose's silver sedan, scheduled for August 13th, 2025. Right below it was the digital cancellation timestamp from only 3 hours later, initiated by a user ID linked to Lillian's business email. The weight of the $2,000 in cash I had given her felt like a physical burn in my pocket. I had paid for the repair. I gave her the money to keep Rose safe, and she used it to sign her death warrant. She didn't just ignore the problem. She actively made sure the safety net was removed. How do you reconcile the daughter who used to hold your hand at the zoo with the woman who calculated the velocity needed for a fatal impact? You don't. You stop being a father, and you start being a witness. As a bridge inspector, I know that no skid marks on an accident report usually means the pilot never had a chance. I cross-referenced the cancellation with the Highway 74 police report. Lillian hadn't just hoped for an accident. She had engineered the failure, knowing Rose's daily route and the exact moment those thinned metal-on-metal pads would finally give way on the descent near the overpass. This isn't theft anymore. This is a murder conspiracy. Hidden in the very back of the folder was a printout of a Google search history from her firm's computer. The phrases stared back at me in cold digital ink. How to simulate brake failure and Charlotte General Hospital DNR policy. I looked at the DNR search result and felt my blood turn to slush. She wasn't just waiting for the accident. She had a plan for the hospital bed, too. I reached for my phone, my hand finally steady with an icy, unwavering resolve. It was time to call the one person who could turn this paper trail into a prison cell. I didn't walk into the law firm. I marched into it with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who spent 40 years ensuring bridges didn't collapse, carrying a briefcase that contained the wreckage of my own family. The glass doors of Caldwell and Associates were polished to a mirror finish, but they couldn't hide the cold, surgical focus I felt vibrating in my own bones. I was no longer just a husband or a father. I was an inspector arriving at a terminal failure site. Jennifer Caldwell, 40. An attorney with a sharp bob and a gaze that could dissect a witness at 50 paces, stood behind her desk with a look of professional concern. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I spread the blueprints of Lillian's theft across her mahogany desk, the forged haylock, the drained retirement statements, and the life insurance beneficiary changes that turned my wife's heartbeat into a countdown for a payday. I watched Jennifer's professional mask slip as she realized the sheer scale of the calculated betrayal. She had seen children steal from their parents before, but she told me she had never seen a child plan their mother's funeral while the woman was still healthy enough to drive. I sat there unwavering and told her the truth she was already seeing. Lillian didn't just want the money. She wanted us gone. Detective West reveals that Lillian's business, Harrow Shepherd Designs, was already under a quiet investigation for tax evasion. And my evidence was the final piece they needed to bring the whole structure down. Have you ever looked at a man whose job is to catch monsters and seen him flinch? That's when you know your own blood has crossed a line no one should ever touch. Detective Anthony West, 50, a man whose suit looked as tired as his eyes, but whose handshake held the weight of 20 years in the Financial Crimes Division, entered the room with a heavy notebook. He grew quiet as I presented the mechanical smoking gun, the logs showing Lillian had canceled the brake repairs I had already paid for. He looked at the search history for simulating brake failure, and then back at me. "This isn't just a paper trail anymore, Douglas," he whispered. "This is a crime scene with a pulse." We were moving beyond financial abuse and into the territory of attempted first-degree murder. The air in the room felt thick, pressurized like a deep-sea cable about to snap. West and Caldwell outlined the initial charges: elder financial abuse, 3 counts of forgery theft by swindle insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. 7 felonies. 1 for every year I spent teaching her how to ride a bike, how to drive, how to be a person. What a waste of a life. I picked up the pen to sign the formal complaint against my own daughter. "Once you sign this, Douglas, there is no making it go away for a family dinner," West warned. "This is the state of North Carolina versus Lillian Harrow Shepherd." I didn't hesitate. "My daughter died the moment she canceled those repairs," I told him, as the ink dried on the page. "I am just seeking justice for my wife." West noted that the notary who signed the forged documents was already flagged in a different fraud case, potentially linking Lillian to a larger criminal network. As I walked to my car, Detective West's last words echoed in my skull. "We're going to need a search warrant for her firm's server, Douglas. There's a file on there she thinks is deleted, but we've already seen the ghost of it." The sound of my phone ringing as I pulled out of the parking lot was a sharp, digital intrusion that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel, the first of many calls that would change the course of the next 48 hours. Detective West didn't wait for a greeting. He told me to turn around and come back to the station immediately. There is a specific kind of cold that doesn't come from the wind. It's the chill that settles in your marrow when you realize your only child has been shopping for your replacement life while you were still living it. I sat in the digital forensics lab, the air smelling of ozone and overworked cooling fans, as West showed me what they had found on the encrypted server. The tech team had bypassed a folder titled Final Transition. It was a blueprint for an erasure. West revealed a series of PDF documents that made the room feel like it was spinning a pre-filled guardianship petition for me, citing early onset cognitive decline and a brochure for Sunset Pines. She had the psych evaluation forms partially filled out. Douglas West said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. She just needed a doctor's signature, and she was already talking to one. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Early onset decline. I am a bridge inspector. I notice things people miss every day. I am not the one losing my mind, but the plan was already in motion. Erased. Not dead, but gone. A ghost in a state-run facility while she toasted to her success in our dining room. I reviewed the spreadsheets found in that folder, and a wave of nausea washed over me. It was an inventory of my life, my specialized workshop tools, Rose's rare first edition book collection, even the wedding china we'd used for 40 years. She had everything priced out for an estate sale. The plan showed that Lillian intended to move us into Sunset Pines within 48 hours of Rose's unfortunate accident, while I was still too shell-shocked to resist the guardianship papers. I discovered that she had already listed our family home on a private pocket listing for investors with a closing date scheduled for just 10 days away. She didn't just want the house. She wanted to sell the memory of us. A home isn't just four walls. It's a structural support for the soul. Lillian was pulling the beams out one by one, waiting for the roof to crush us. I looked up Sunset Pines on my phone while West continued the briefing. The reviews were a horror story of neglect and locked wards. "This place, it is a prison for the old," I whispered. She wanted to lock us away in a room with a view of a brick wall. West nodded grimly. She wanted to erase the evidence of where she came from, Douglas. It is time to show her we are still here. The psych eval document wasn't just a draft. It had been falsified with a forged signature from a local clinic where Lillian did a design project, making the guardianship process look dangerously imminent. I looked at that forged report and felt a new kind of fear. She wasn't just stealing our money. She was setting a trap that would strip me of my legal right to even speak. And then West's phone buzzed with an incoming text from the lab. "Douglas, they just decrypted the private messages. You need to hear this. How long does it take for a father to become a stranger in the fluorescent hum of a digital forensics lab?" I realized it takes exactly the amount of time it takes to read a price list for your own institutionalization. I stood in the lab processing the Sunset Pines documents, while Detective West worked on a second terminal, his keyboard clicking like a rapid-fire pulse. For decades, I had been the man people called to ensure structures could withstand the relentless pressure of time and gravity. I had inspected every bolt and cable of the most complex spans in the state, yet I had been completely blind to the rust eating through the foundation of my own home. I realized now that Lillian didn't just want the assets. She wasn't just after the house or the savings. She wanted to remove the witnesses of her past so she could reinvent herself as a self-made success story. A woman who rose from nothing, instead of a woman who was carried on the shoulders of parents she eventually liquidated. She was trying to burn the blueprints of who I am, I said, my voice barely audible over the cooling fans. West paused, looking at me with a grim, knowing sympathy. "We're seeing this more often, Douglas. Predatory heirs don't want a family. They want a trust fund. They see people as obstacles to be managed or deleted. A conspiracy isn't a single explosion. It's thousands of tiny termites eating the floorboards until you fall through into the basement." I found a to-do list in the server files that made my stomach lurch. Cancel Rose's supplemental insurance was checked off the day before the crash. She was ensuring the hospital bills would drain the estate even faster, leaving us even more vulnerable. West pointed out a recurring name in the final transition folder, Marcus Webb. I recognized it immediately. He was the corrupt notary who worked exclusively for the high-end real estate developers Lillian designed for. Marcus Webb. He is the one who stamped the HELOC. I said, the clarity of the situation feeling like a sheet of ice. He has been on her payroll for years. West nodded, making a note. "We'll pick him up too. Forgery at this level carries a mandatory minimum. He won't hold out long once he sees the paper trail we have. Recorded." She sat across from me at dinner months ago, passing the salt and recording my stumbles like a hunter tracking a wounded deer. I discovered a hidden recording she'd made during a night where I'd forgotten a minor detail about a neighbor's name. It was labeled, "Evidence of Cognitive Decline Guardianship." I looked at a family photo on my phone, one taken last Christmas. I saw the calculated, practiced smile on Lillian's face and realized she was likely checking the balance of our accounts while the shutter clicked. The Lillian I loved was a fictional character, a role she played until the payoff was high enough to drop the mask. The woman in these server files was a predator, a terminal flaw in the structure of my life that had to be addressed with the same clinical precision I used to condemn a failing bridge. I'm done being the father, I told the empty air. From here on out, I'm just the lead witness. I closed the laptop and looked at West. The technicalities were over. The internal debate was dead. Play the decrypted messages, detective. Let's see just how deep this grave goes. The blue light of the monitor reflected off Detective West's glasses, turning his eyes into cold digital voids as the first string of decrypted messages crawled across the screen. I watched the flickering text, my breath hitching in a chest that felt increasingly hollow. The screen of the forensics terminal hummed to life, revealing a scrolling log of private messages that stripped away the last of the illusions I held about my daughter. These were not the words of a child. They were the blueprints of a predator. I leaned in my hands, gripped so tightly on the edge of the desk that the plastic groaned. The logs from August 12th were the first to hit me. It was the day I had given Lillian $2,000 for the repairs. I read her message to Beckett. The squeal is loud, but the pads are thin enough. One more trip down the 74 should do it. I felt a numbing horror wash over me. The accident wasn't a gamble she'd hoped for. It was a calculated mechanical failure timed to a specific geographic incline. She knew. She heard those brakes screaming for help, and she just waited for the laws of physics to do her dirty work. It's right here, Douglas West said, his voice dropping an octave as he pointed at the timestamps. One more trip. That is premeditation. The twist in my gut worsened as I saw that Beckett wasn't just a bystander. He was the one who physically called the shop to cancel the appointment at Lillian's direct request. Liability. My wife wasn't a woman to them. She was a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be zeroed out. The log jumped to the night of the crash, September 4th. While I was pacing the waiting room in a cold sweat, praying for a miracle, Lillian was texting Beckett about DNR protocols and letting nature take its course. She argued that wasting liquid assets on long-term care for a depreciating liability was a poor business move. Depreciating liability. Is that what 34 years of motherly love gets you? She was coaching Beckett on how to convince me to sign the papers, Douglas West whispered. How do you breathe when you realize the person you taught to walk was just waiting for you to fall so they could pick your pockets? The forensic hammer came down with a final message sent on. September 5th, shortly before she arrived at the hospital in that white Tesla. She told Beckett to keep the car in the garage and act stressed so I wouldn't suspect a thing. But the darkest part was her backup plan. She'd already looked into alternative home health accidents involving Rose's medication if the brakes had held. We have enough, West said, standing up with an icy finality. This is attempted first-degree murder for financial gain. I looked at the scrolling evidence of a soul that had rotted long ago. Do it, I replied, my voice as hard as the steel I once inspected. Arrest them. Both of them. West closed the laptop and stood up. The light of the screen still burned into my retinas. Get some sleep, Douglas, he said softly. The tactical team meets at 0500. By 0600, your daughter will be in handcuffs. I stood up, my joints feeling like rusted hinges, and walked out of the lab. The world was cold, but the path ahead was finally clear. A house without a wife feels lonely, but a house without the daughter you believed you raised becomes something worse. A hollow shell where every room echoes with the ghosts of lies told across years of family dinners. When I stepped into the foyer of our home in Matthews, North Carolina, the silence felt unnatural, almost heavy. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Rose's wedding ring rested cold in my pocket, a small circle of gravity that reminded me how fragile everything had become. I carried it upstairs and placed it gently on her bedside table, setting it beside the bottle of hand lotion she applied every night before sleep. For a moment I stood there staring at the empty pillow beside it, trying to imagine her returning home. Then I began walking through the house, not as a husband, as an inspector. For 40 years, I had examined bridges for hidden weaknesses, stress fractures and concrete rust, creeping through steel beams. Now I moved from room to room, studying the structural integrity of my own family. What I saw made me realize something painful: the damage hadn't appeared overnight. The rot had been spreading quietly for years. On the mantel sat photographs of Lillian growing up, her gap-toothed smile from second grade, the soccer trophies she proudly held in muddy hands, the graduation portrait, where she stood beneath a navy cap and gown. Once those images had marked milestones in a life I believed I understood. Now they looked different. Less like memories, more like the early stages of a carefully planned deception. A sudden instinct pushed me toward the kitchen floor. I knelt beside the oak dining table, examining the baseboards along the wall, checking for anything that felt out of place. My fingers brushed something small and plastic hidden beneath the table's edge, a tiny black tab. I pulled it loose and felt my stomach tighten. It was a high-sensitivity recording device. For months, maybe longer, someone had been listening to our private conversations while we ate breakfast together. Listening while we laughed, argued, or spoke about money. She wasn't just stealing, I murmured to the empty chairs around the table. She was spying. The word that followed came quietly. Parasite. At 5:47 p.m., the house phone suddenly chirped. The landline was an old habit of mine, a hardwired connection that didn't depend on cell signals or batteries. I kept it only for emergencies. The caller ID display flickered to life. Mecklenburg County Jail. My blood turned cold. The phone rang again. Once that sound had meant a daughter checking in, calling to share news about work or dinner plans. Now it sounded like metal bars slamming shut. An automated voice began speaking when the answering system activated. You have a collect call from an inmate. Press 1 to accept. I sat back in the mahogany armchair across the room, watching the phone vibrate against the wooden table. Not today. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Not ever again. The ringing stopped. Silence returned to the house. But 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Then again at 6:15. By the time the sun dipped low behind the trees outside, my missed call log showed 7 attempts. I opened a fresh notebook and began writing each one down like entries in an engineering report. Time. Duration. Caller ID. Each ring felt like another stress test on a structure that had already collapsed. 7 calls asking for help, money, or legal rescue. 0 calls asking if her mother was still alive. A family is like a bridge. When the main cables snap, you don't try to tie them together with rope. You let the structure fall and rebuild somewhere stronger. I was about to close the notebook when the phone rang again. The 8th call. But this one looked different. It wasn't coming from the jail's general line. The number traced back to a prepaid account linked to Beckett. I stared at the screen, suddenly understanding something important. The cracks in their marriage were already spreading. Beckett wasn't calling to apologize for the brake lines or the stolen money. He was calling because he wanted to sell Lillian out before she had the chance to betray him first. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in the ICU at 4 a.m. A heavy, clinical quiet, where the only thing louder than the machines is the sound of a father's heart hardening into stone. I sat in the dimly lit room beside Rose, watching the mechanical rhythm of her ventilator. The pale green light of the heart monitor cast long, flickering shadows against the sterile walls, making the room feel like a submersible deep underwater. I reached out and took Rose's hand. It was cool, the skin like fine parchment. I realized that while I had spent 40 years ensuring the structural integrity of bridges across this state, I had been blind to the rot eating the foundation of my own home. I'm fixing the foundation, Addie, I whispered to her comatose form. No more leaks. No more rot. I spent the quiet hours performing a structural purge of our legal lives. While reviewing the medical files I'd requested from the nursing station, a cold shock hit me. I discovered that Lillian had already tried to sign a comfort care only waiver for Rose 48 hours ago. If the hospital hadn't flagged the pending insurance dispute, she would have effectively stopped all life-saving treatment while I was at the hardware store. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was lethal. The night nurse, a man named Nathan with soft-soled shoes and a quiet efficiency that respected the gravity of the room, moved around the bed like a shadow. He checked the IV bag, the smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile plastic following him. I looked up and handed him the forms. "I need to remove my daughter from all medical decision-making roles," I said, my voice as flat and hard as a granite slab. Effective immediately. Marcus took the clipboard, his eyes reflecting a weary understanding. "I'll get the social worker to notarize the change at shift change, Mr. Harrow." I watched him leave, then picked up my black pen. Delete! A 6-letter word that carries more weight than 1,000 apologies. One click, and 34 years of history become an empty folder. I struck through Lillian's name on every document, the ink bleeding into the paper like a final judgment. I listed Basil Redmond as the primary contact, feeling a literal weight lift from my chest as the legal tether to my daughter was severed. I opened my laptop, the blue light stinging my eyes. I began the digital exile, changing every password and removing Lillian from every shared account. I found a photo of her as my wallpaper, a picture from her graduation, where she looked so bright and promising. With a steady thumb, I selected delete. Pruning a family tree is messy work. You end up with sap on your hands and a hole where a branch used to be. But it is the only way to save the trunk. "You are not a Harrow anymore," I muttered to the empty air. "You are just a case number." As I finished the final purge, I found an old handwritten emergency plan in Rose's purse that she'd written years ago. Her shaky script from 3 years ago stated clearly that she never wanted Lillian to have control over her care. I looked at the note and realized I wasn't the only one she had been hiding things from. She knew, and as the sun began to rise over Charlotte, the hospital doors opened for my attorney with news of the arraignment. The oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a groan that sounded like a bridge cable snapping under too much tension, and for the first time in my life I wasn't there to fix the break. I walked into the galley, adjusting my tie with fingers that felt like cold iron. I had spent the night purging my daughter from every digital and legal corner of my life, but the physical reality of the courtroom was a different kind of audit. I took my seat in the front row, my back as straight as a support beam. A moment later, Lillian was led in through a side door. The designer poise I had seen her wear like armor only days ago was gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hair was a bird's nest, and her eyes were wild as she scanned the room. When she locked eyes with me, she immediately attempted a look of tearful innocence, her lip trembling in that rehearsed way she'd used since she was 6. I met her gaze with the clinical, unblinking focus of a bridge inspector, assessing a condemned structure. I offered no comfort, no recognition. "Daddy, please," she mouthed the words, silent behind the glass partition. I whispered to the empty seat beside me where Rose should have been sitting. "The inspection is over." Judge Miller, a man with silver hair and a reputation for being as unyielding as the granite of the courthouse steps, looked down from the bench with zero patience for theatricality. Prosecutor Rachel, a woman who carried her case files like a loaded weapon, stood ready to dismantle the Harrow-Shepard defense. She began reading the 7 felony counts, her voice echoing in the deathly silent room. The details of the final transition plan and the canceled brake repairs spilled out into the public record like toxic waste. Guilty. Not the verdict, but the weight of the air in the room. You could smell it on her stale fear and expensive perfume. Lillian's defense attorney tried to argue for a personal recognizance bond, citing her status in the community, but the floor fell out from under them mid-hearing. The attorney asked to be recused, stating that the retainers had been paid with stolen funds that the state had already clawed back. Is it possible to feel sorry for a wolf that finally got caught in the trap it set for its own pack? I looked for that pity in my chest, and found only an empty, echoing hallway. Judge Miller leaned forward, his gaze piercing. The state requests a high bond, and this court agrees. Bail is set at $750,000. Cash or surety. The irony hit the room like a physical blow. It was the precise value of Rose's life insurance policy. Lillian collapsed into her seat, her face a mask of shattered glass. "I don't have that, Dad. Tell them," she shrieked as the bailiffs moved in. I didn't wait for the gavel to hit the sound block. I stood up and turned my back on the woman I used to call my daughter, walking toward the exit, while she was still being led away to a cell she couldn't buy her way out of. As I stepped past the heavy oak doors and into the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from Jennifer, but it was a text from Nurse Joyce. "Rose is awake. She's asking for Lillian." My world tilted on its axis. I burst through the ICU doors, still smelling of the courthouse stale coffee and cold justice, only to find the one thing I wasn't prepared for, the light finally returning to Rose's eyes. My tires had shrieked against the asphalt of the parking lot as I raced back to Charlotte General. My mind a blurring collision of the orange jumpsuit I'd just left behind and the woman I'd prayed to see wake for weeks. When I reached her bedside, she was propped up against the pillows, her face pale, but her gaze focused. "Douglas," she asked, her voice a thin, raspy thread that snagged on my heart. "Why is it so bright in here? Where is Lillian?" She was supposed to meet me for lunch. She was talking about a lunch from 7 months ago. I reached for her hand, my skin feeling rough and calloused against hers, which still carried the faint scent of hospital soap and antiseptic. "Addie, take it slow," I whispered, trying to keep my voice from cracking like sun-baked timber. "You have been asleep for a while." She looked at me with a confused, soft smile, then mentioned that she'd secretly given Lillian a second set of keys to my private workshop back in the spring. She thought it would help us bond over my old blueprints. The revelation was a fresh puncture wound. Lillian hadn't broken into my files she'd been invited in by the very woman she intended to kill. Amnesia isn't a blank slate. It's a structural bypass. Her mind had built a bridge over the truth, because the truth was a drop too steep to survive. "Doctor," Aris stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of professional triumph and clinical caution. He explained the retrograde amnesia, the lost months, that coincidentally covered every moment of Lillian's escalating theft. To my wife, our daughter was still the perfect, devoted girl who brought her lavender lattes and shared secrets. She wouldn't just leave me here. Douglas Rose insisted, her voice gaining a frantic, sharp edge. "Did you say something to her? Did you two have another fight about her business?" She looked at me not with love, but with a growing suspicion that I was the one standing in the way of her happiness. "It's not a fight, Addie. It is a criminal case." I said the words feeling heavy and wrong in the sterile air. Liar. That word coming from Rose's lips felt sharper than any shard of glass on Highway 74. She began to struggle against the translucent tubes tethering her to the monitors. "You are lying. You have always been too hard on her. You're jealous because she's successful. Get out, I want my daughter." The machines began to wail a chorus of electronic panic as her heart rate spiked on the monitor. I tried to reach for her to show her the bank records I carried in my pocket, but she recoiled as if my touch was poison. "I want Beckett." She screamed, her face flushed a dangerous red. "He's the only honest one, call Beckett." She had no idea he was the one who had already traded her life for a reduced sentence. The nurses swarmed the bed, their blue scrubs a blur of motion as they moved to sedate her. As they pushed me toward the door, Rose's voice followed me into the hall, raw and desperate. "I know my daughter, Douglas. She would never hurt me." I stood in the corridor, the silence of the hospital settling over me like a shroud, and I knew there was only one way left to save her. I had to show her the practice sheets. A bridge doesn't just fall. It screams before the steel snaps, And as I walked back toward Rose's room with the evidence in my hand, I could already hear the sound of her world tearing apart. I sat for a moment in the hospital cafeteria, my fingers white-knuckled around the manila folder that contained the death of her illusions. The tea in front of me had gone cold, as stagnant as the air in this building. I knew that what I was about to do would be more invasive than any of the surgeries Rose had endured. But leaving the cancer of Lillian's lies in her mind was a risk I could no longer take. I met Basil Redmond in the hallway just outside the ICU. He gave me a curt nod, his old man charm already deployed, as he leaned against the nurse's station, regaling the young staff with a convoluted story about his hardware store days. It was the perfect screen. I slipped past the station and into Rose's room. She was sitting up, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the door, still searching for the daughter who was currently being fingerprinted in a county jail cell. "I am not here to argue anymore, Addie," I said, my voice as unwavering as a support beam. "I am here to show you the truth." She started to turn away, the old defiance flickering in her gaze, but I moved faster. I spread the practice forgery sheets across her lap. Ink, rows and rows of it. A daughter's love, expressed in the calligraphy of a crime. I pointed to the slant of the A in her name, written hundreds of times in Lillian's sharp, distinctive cursive. I showed her the tablet Lillian had gifted her for her birthday, explaining how the digital trail proved it was a Trojan horse, used to mirror her banking apps and track her movements. Rose's breath hitched. She was practicing, she whispered, her fingers hovering over the paper as if it might burn her, like a school assignment. Denial is a sturdy wall, but once the first brick is pulled, the whole structure becomes a landslide. I watched the dust settle in her eyes. I laid out the bank statements, next the six-figure transfers, and finally the forged life insurance policy, where her signature was a dead, static mimicry of her own hand. Rose traced the ink with a trembling finger, her touchlight on the paper. I watched as her face shifted from confusion to a hollowed-out horror that made her look smaller than I had ever seen her. The realization of the premeditation hit her like a physical blow. She found a note I had almost missed, a draft from Lillian to a real estate agent describing Rose's failing health as a reason to expedite our home sale, written 3 months before the car ever left the road. "She didn't love me, Douglas," she whispered, her voice like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "She was just waiting for me to be worth more dead than alive. She didn't scream or fight this time. She simply began to shake, a silent structural collapse that signaled the end of our family as we knew it." Rose pushed the papers away, her face a mask of gray stone. "Call the attorney, Douglas," she whispered. "I want to sign the restraining order. And then, I want to hear the 40-second call." I took her hand, the weight of the truth finally shared, and felt the first cold breeze of a winter that would never end. The phone didn't just ring. It screamed a high-pitched digital demand that sliced through the midnight silence of a house that finally knew the truth. I stood in my dark kitchen, the only light coming from the glowing rectangle on the counter. The caller ID read Mecklenburg County Jail. I stared at it, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. I thought about the 41 calls I had ignored while Rose was fighting for her breath in the ICU. I remembered the coldness of the hospital bills and the surgical precision of the forged signatures I'd found in my own office. This wasn't just a phone call. It was the final inspection of a bridge that had already collapsed into the river. "One last time, Lillian," I whispered to the empty room. "Let us see what $1 million is worth to you now." I reached out and tapped the screen, accepting the charges. "Dad, oh thank God." Her voice was frantic, stripped of every ounce of that designer poise she'd worn like a second skin. "You have to get me out of here, Douglas. It is disgusting, and the women in here are animals. My lawyer said, you have the insurance money, use it. I want to go home." I felt a wave of nausea so strong it tasted like copper. "The insurance money," I asked, my voice as flat as a Carolina plain. You mean the 750,000 you tried to collect while your mother was still breathing? Lillian didn't even pause. She actually told me she felt relieved the Tesla had been seized because the payout on Rose would have upgraded her to a better model anyway. 31. A number that represents every time she chose her own comfort over her mother's survival. Before I tell you what she said next, let me ask you something. Are you still with this story? Comment A if you think I should hang up, or B if I should keep listening. And add one word that describes how you feel right now. Quick note, the next part includes some dramatized details for deeper emotional impact. 42 calls, Lillian, I said, cutting through her excuses. Not once did you ask if she woke up. Not once did you ask if she could speak. You didn't even ask if her heart was still beating. I was stressed. Dad, I am the victim here, she shrieked. I realized then that the structural failure was total. There was no empathy left in the woman who shared my DNA. Hanging up that phone felt like cutting the final cable on a bridge that was already underwater. Rose is awake, I told her, and the silence on the other end was absolute. She has seen the forgery sheets. She is the one who signed the restraining order. I am not your father anymore, Lillian. I'm just a witness. I hung up the phone and blocked the number, the weight finally leaving my chest. I set the device on the counter and watched the screen go dark. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. Lillian was gone, and now I had to prepare for the man who was going to help me bury her, legally Beckett Shepard. I knew I was recording the whole thing, and her admission of motive was the final nail in her coffin. I walked into the law firm with a steady hand and a clear head carrying the recording of last night's call, like a finishing tool for a job that had taken far too long to complete. The silence of the counter and the dark kitchen were behind me, now replaced by the humming efficiency of Jennifer Caldwell's office. I sat across from her, my briefcase resting on my knees, feeling like a man who had finally located the terminal stress point in a failing structure. Jennifer looked up from a thick stack of documents, her expression one of grim satisfaction. Beckett Shepard has officially signed a cooperation agreement, she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold legal certainty. He flipped faster than a rusted bridge beam under a heavy load, Douglas. He wasn't protecting her. He was just waiting for the right price to sell her out. Facing 45 years for his role in the insurance fraud and brake sabotage, my son-in-law had traded Lillian's freedom for his own. He had handed over a hidden cloud storage password containing months of recorded arguments and planning sessions. A rat will always leave a sinking ship. But Beckett didn't just jump. He chewed through the hull on his way out to make sure Lillian went down with the wreck. Beckett's statement revealed that the car crash on Highway 74 wasn't her first attempt. She had actually begun practicing small-scale sabotage on my own truck months prior to ensure she knew exactly how to make it look like a mechanical fluke. Jennifer turned her monitor toward me and pressed play on a recovered audio file from August 12th. Lillian's voice filled the room, laughing as she spoke to Beckett. The old man is too blind to see the rust I am putting in his life. She had said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing a kitchen renovation. I can't wait 30 years for an inheritance, Beckett. Nature needs a little push. I sat perfectly still, my skin crawling. That is my daughter talking about killing her mother. She explicitly detailed using the insurance payout to settle Beckett's gambling debts and fund her firm's expansion. Airtight. The most beautiful word in an inspector's vocabulary. No cracks, no leaks, no escape. The attorney explained that this testimony, combined with the forensic recordings and the 42 call logs I had provided, made the case unwinnable for the defense. Lillian had even picked out a memorial garden for Rose before the crash happened, using the design as a pitch to show prospective investors how her brand honored legacy. It was a level of sociopathic planning that exceeded even my darkest suspicions. This is it, Douglas, Jennifer said, closing the file with a definitive thud. We have the motive, the method, and now the confession. Build the case, I replied, my voice as flat as a Carolina plane. I want it airtight. I want her to never see the sun as a free woman again. I gave the formal approval to proceed to the grand jury, realizing the structural failure of her marriage was the one thing she hadn't accounted for in her blueprints of betrayal. I walked out of Jennifer's office and felt the first true breeze of the fall. The trap was set. The evidence was undeniable. But as I headed toward my car to tell Rose the news, my phone buzzed with an alert from a private investigator Basil had hired on the side. I looked at the name on the screen and felt my heart skip a beat. The smell of roasting turkey used to be a warning sign in this house, a precursor to Lillian's complaints about the table setting or her subtle jabs at our modest lifestyle. But this year, the air just smelled like home. I stood in my kitchen in Matthews, North Carolina, watching the steam rise from a pot of mashed potatoes, feeling a quietude I hadn't known in decades. The frantic energy that used to accompany her arrival was gone, replaced by a steady, rhythmic peace. Rose was beside me, walking with a cane now, but steady on her feet, her eyes bright and clear of the fog that had nearly claimed her. She was humming as she helped with the stuffing, her movements slow but deliberate. "You know, Douglas, the silence doesn't feel lonely today," she said, pausing to look out the window at the autumn leaves. "It feels clean." I nodded, squeezing her shoulder. "It is the lack of friction, Addie. The bridge isn't vibrating anymore. Last year, Lillian had spent this day borrowing our credit card for a designer splurge, while claiming she was too busy to even set the table. This year, the house felt structurally lighter, freed from the weight of her terminal entitlement. Loose. That's how my chest felt for the first time in a decade. No tightness. No waiting for the next disaster to drop from her lips. Jennifer Caldwell had shared a disturbing update earlier. Lillian had attempted to send a Thanksgiving card from jail that was actually a coded message to hide secondary assets. Even behind bars, she was still trying to manage her blueprints of greed. By 2 p.m., our chosen family began to arrive. Basil Redmond walked in first, carrying a bottle of high-end cider and a grin that could light up a dark tunnel. Nurse Joyce, who had become a regular weekend visitor and a true confidant to Rose, followed close behind. Jennifer Caldwell joined us shortly after shedding her attorney persona for the warmth of a friend. This new circle of loyalty stood in stark contrast to the transactional relationships Lillian had curated. Basil pulled me aside to mention the PI's findings. Lillian was currently trying to design her jail cell with contraband, apparently refusing to accept a reality that didn't involve silk and marble. Family isn't always a foundation you are born with. Sometimes it is a retrofit, adding new supports to an old house until it can finally stand on its own. We sat down in the dining room, the table filled with food and the sound of genuine laughter. I looked at the empty space where Lillian used to sit. I didn't feel grief, only a clinical sense of relief that the rot had finally been excised. I realized that while I had lost a daughter of blood, I had gained a village of steel. Rose revealed she had spent the morning setting up a small trust fund for Joyce's children, using the first bit of our recovered funds to pay back the kindness that had saved her life. "We aren't looking back today," I said, raising my glass for a toast. "We are looking at who is at the table right now." As the laughter around the table rose, Jennifer leaned in and whispered to me, "Enjoy the peace, Douglas. Tomorrow morning, we start the mock trials. The prosecution is ready to play the 42 calls for the jury." I felt a chill, but I didn't shake. The foundation was set. I thought I had drained every drop of grief out of my system in that ICU waiting room. But as the courtroom doors locked with a heavy metallic click, I realized that some ghosts only scream when they're put on the public record. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the prosecutor's office from the previous Monday were nothing compared to the cold, cavernous judgment of courtroom 1856. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my fingers intertwined so tightly they felt like a single piece of fused bone. The bailiff called the court to order, and the air in the room became pressurized, heavy with the weight of impending justice. Prosecutor Rachel stood with the posture of someone who had already seen the end of the world and survived it. She delivered a blistering opening statement, framing the case as a calculated assassination of family trust. She introduced the 42 calls motif, explaining how Lillian used the jail's communication system not to seek forgiveness, but to further her extortion. I watched my daughter at the defense table. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, trying to mimic a professional persona that had long since rotted away. One of the early calls played during the opening revealed Lillian attempting to coach Beckett on how to accidentally delete our home office backup server while I was still at the hospital. She wasn't looking for a family, Rachel told the jury. She was looking for a payout. Detective West was called to the stand to authenticate the recordings. As the first 10 calls played, I felt a familiar nausea. Lillian's voice filled the room, not sobbing or broken, but demanding and shrill. She complained about the thread count of the jail blankets and the quality of the water. Vitamins. She was worried about her skin regimen and demanded Beckett find her designer supplements while the woman who gave her life was being kept alive by a machine. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a blade. Have you ever heard your own voice break over a PA system? It sounds like the structural failure of a man's entire belief system, broadcast in high definition. The prosecution saved the final set of calls for the end of the morning session. The courtroom fell into a pin-drop silence as my own recorded voice finally answered the 42nd attempt. The raw pain of that midnight confrontation echoed through the speakers, filling every corner of the room. "Did you ever ask if Mom was alive?" the speakers blared. "Did you ever ask if she could breathe?" Several jurors were visibly crying, wiping their eyes with crumpled tissues. "I'm not your father anymore. Goodbye, Lillian." The audio revealed a 30-second ghost call she tried to make to a private investigator to track my movements after I hung up, proving the hunt never stopped. As the audio died out, the lead juror looked directly at Lillian with a look of such visceral loathing that I knew the trial was already over in their minds. Her mask of composure finally shattered not into tears, but into a scowl of pure narcissistic rage. She leaned over and whispered something into her lawyer's ear that made the man turn pale, his eyes darting toward me with a sudden sharp fear. "The state calls Douglas Harrow," Rachel announced. I stood up my legs, feeling like lead pipes, and moved toward the witness stand to finish what I had started. The witness stand is a lonely place, a small island of wood and Bible-sworn truth, surrounded by a sea of people waiting to see if you'll sink or swim under the weight of your own tragedy. My hand trembled slightly as I placed it on the Bible to take the oath, the leather cool and worn under my palm. I looked up and scanned the jury box. A retired teacher in the front row was clutching her tissues, her face a map of empathy, while a young man in the back stared at Lillian with a look of pure clinical judgment. The atmosphere was thick with the residue of the recordings they had just heard. It felt like a bridge undergoing a final terminal stress test. I realized then that I didn't need to be an avenger. I just needed to be the inspector who points out the rot. I took my seat and looked toward the defense table. "They see you now, Lillian," I thought. "No amount of Italian wool can hide the structural failure of your soul." As I began my testimony, my eyes caught a glint of white gold at her ears. She was wearing Rose's vintage pearl earrings, the ones my wife only wore for anniversaries. She must have stolen them during her last visit before the arrest. It was one more small, jagged theft in a lifetime of them. During my direct examination, Lillian didn't show an ounce of fear. Instead, she sighed loudly and rolled her eyes as I described the long nights I spent by Rose's bedside in the ICU. She whispered to her lawyer, a smirk dancing on her lips that suggested she found the entire proceeding beneath her dignity. Her entitlement was a physical presence in the room, clashing violently with the emotional wreckage the jury had just endured. Have you ever seen a mask shatter? It doesn't break into clean pieces. It splinters into something jagged and dangerous. The prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I discovered the folder labeled Final Transition. I spoke about the nursing home brochure and the spreadsheets that priced out our lives like scrap metal. "Dad, stop being so dramatic," Lillian hissed from the table. "Order," Defendant will remain silent. Judge Miller barked his gavel, striking with a sharp crack, but the dam had already burst. Lillian finally snapped. She stood up, her face contorting into a mask of narcissistic fury. "It was a 5-star facility, you ungrateful old man," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I was fixing your mess. I was providing you a lifestyle you were too unrefined to appreciate." In those 30 seconds, she confirmed every accusation. She actually argued about the quality of the prison she'd chosen for me. That was her love. The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence as she inadvertently revealed she had already paid a non-refundable deposit to Sunset Pines, using the money stolen from our equity line. 5-star. She had institutionalized our future before the brakes even failed. Lillian sank back into her chair, her chest heaving while the lead juror scribbled a single word on his notepad in letters so large I could see the ink from the stand. The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a sentencing. I sat there unwavering, watching the dust of her reputation settle. But then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination, his expression shifting into a shark-like grin. He was holding a grainy, sepia-toned photo I hadn't seen in years, and the air in the room suddenly turned very cold. Mr. Thorne didn't just walk toward the stand. He circled it like a shark that had scented a crack in a deep-sea cable, holding a glossy 10 by 12 photo like a jagged piece of shrapnel. I sat on the witness stand, my hands resting flat on the railing, watching the defense lead approach. Mr. Thorne, the defense lead with a suit that cost more than a small car, and a smile that never quite reached his predatory eyes, leaned over the witness rail. He slapped the photograph down in front of me. I recognized it instantly, the 2018 bypass collapse. It was a file I kept in my private workshop, a reminder of the one professional scar I carried. I realized then that Beckett Shepard must have stolen this during one of our bonding visits, a calculated theft intended to weaponize my own history against me. "You are an expert at missing the signs of structural collapse, aren't you, Mr. Harrow Thorne?" asked his voice, dripping with condescension. "You inspected this span weeks before it fell, yet you found nothing. Is it possible your accusations against your daughter are just another example of you missing the truth until it is too late to save face?" I looked at the image, then up at the jury. "I follow the data, Mr. Thorne." I replied, my voice calm and low. "Even when it hurts, steel is honest. It moans when it's tired and it snaps when it's broken. People, they just smile and keep tightening the bolts until you're crushed under the weight of their expectations." I leaned into the microphone, the silence in the courtroom so absolute. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. A bridge is easy to inspect because it doesn't have a soul or the ability to lie to your face. It doesn't pretend to love you while it is failing. I spent 40 years looking for cracks in concrete. I didn't think I had to look for them in my own daughter's heart. Lillian used my own methodology against me, hiding the rust behind a facade of success and designer wool. I failed. There, I said it. The inspector missed the biggest collapse of his career because he was too busy loving the ruin. I addressed the jury directly, my gaze steady. I failed my parenting audit. I saw the entitlement and the greed years ago, but I chose to patch the cracks with money and silence because I wanted to believe the structure was sound. I let the rot spread until the whole family came down. But I'm not missing it now. I looked back at the photo Thorne had presented. Interestingly, Mr. Thorne, this bypass failed because of a fraudulent notary who certified the substandard steel, a man named Marcus Webb. The same Marcus Webb who notarized my daughter's forged documents. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Mr. Thorne's face went from a shark's grin to the pallor of a dead fish as I mentioned Marcus Webb. He looked back at Lillian, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the back of the courtroom, where the doors were opening for the one person she never expected to see, in a wheelchair, her mother. The rhythmic squeak of the wheelchair was the only sound in the room, a slow, clinical march, that felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down the seconds of Lillian's freedom. I stood by the witness rail, my heart performing a heavy, uneven cadence against my ribs. Rose was being wheeled down the center aisle by Nurse Joyce, and as she passed the gallery, a profound hush settled over the room. She looked frail, her skin still carrying the translucent pallor of hospital lighting, but her eyes held a terrifying motherly clarity that I hadn't seen since before the brakes failed. With the help of the bailiff and my own steadying hands, Rose was transferred to the witness stand. "I can stand, Douglas," she whispered, her fingers gripping my forearm with surprising strength. "I want her to see me standing." I stepped back, nodding. "Take your time, Addie. The whole world is waiting." The jury leaned in, the shift from my technical inspections to her physical presence making the courtroom feel oxygen-deprived. She revealed then that she had actually regained her memory weeks earlier than she told the doctors, using that silent time to privately review every bank statement with Jennifer to ensure her testimony was a cage with no exits. Rose spoke about the morning of the crash, her voice a quiet, hollowed-out grief that was more devastating than any scream. She described the feel of the brake pedal sinking uselessly to the floor and the memory of Lillian kissing her cheek just an hour before. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of her wheelchair was a metronome for a daughter's ending. "She knew I was going to the store," Rose said, looking at the court reporter. "She knew that hill on Highway 74. She even checked my seatbelt. I thought she was being protective. I didn't know she was making sure I stayed in the seat for the impact. How much is a mother's life worth in Charlotte real estate? Apparently about 3 bedrooms and a gourmet kitchen. Before I explain what that number truly means, are you still with me? If you were in her place, what would you choose? Comment A if you think she should forgive, or B if you believe she should show no mercy. And tell me the reason behind your choice." A quick note, the next part includes some recreated details added for narrative depth. Prosecutor Rachel presented the records for the $120,000 condo down payment. Rose looked directly at Lillian, not with hate, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. "Tell me, Lillian, was the master suite worth the 2 months I spent in a coma?" she asked. "Was the view of the city worth the sound of my ventilator?" Lillian tried to look away, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. "I did it for the firm," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You don't understand the pressure." Rose didn't blink. She slowly produced a small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. It was a handwritten note Lillian had left in the ICU during one of those private visits, threatening to pull the plug if Rose ever woke up and talked. As Rose held up the threatening note, the defense table erupted into a panicked huddle, but I was focused on Lillian's face. The narcissism was finally gone, replaced by the wide-eyed animal terror of a person who realizes the cage door has finally locked from the outside. There is a finality to the way a bailiff calls a room to order that reminds me of the last bolt being driven into a bridge's main span. Once it is in, the structure is set for better or for worse. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hand tightly interlaced with Rose's. Her palm was warm, a living, breathing testament to the failure of Lillian's blueprints. The jury had been out for 6 hours, a span of time that felt like 6 years. But as they filed back into the box, I saw the lead juror's eyes. They didn't look at the defense table. They looked at Rose. The foreman stood, clearing his throat into a silence so thick it felt pressurized. On the count of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word fell like a heavy stone into a deep pool. Guilty on all 7 counts. I felt Rose's grip tighten until it was almost painful. "It is over, Douglas," she whispered, her voice a fragile but unbroken thread. The bridge finally held. Lillian sat perfectly still, her designer suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. Her face was a mask of shock as the legal reality finally overrode her narcissistic delusions. As she was being led away in handcuffs, she tried to lunge toward Rose, her lips forming a frantic, silent plea for one last manipulation. A deputy stepped between them, physically enforcing the restraining order and marking the first time in her life that she could not claw her way into her mother's space. Judge Miller didn't hesitate during the sentencing phase. He spoke of the calculating, predatory nature of the crime, his voice echoing off the high marble walls. 45 years. He announced, the gavel striking the wood with the sound of a closing cell door. You used your intelligence to build a cage for your parents. Now you will live in one built by the state. 45. A lifetime. The exact amount of time it takes for a legacy to turn to dust. Lillian finally broke, but not in remorse. She screamed about the unfairness of the system and how she was an artist, an entrepreneur meant for greatness. I watched as she was led through the side door, her voice fading into the bowels of the courthouse until there was nothing left but the hum of the air conditioner. I helped Rose out of her seat, my movements slow and careful. We declined to give a statement to the press, walking past the flashing cameras in a shared, dignified silence. The sun was too bright, the air too cold, and the world too loud. It was the most beautiful day I had ever seen. We reached the courthouse steps and stopped for a moment to breathe the crisp November air. I reached into my pocket and found a small, forgotten drawing Lillian had made as a child. A crude, colorful sketch of a bridge. I looked at it for a heartbeat, then left it on the courtroom bench as we walked away. It was my final release of the daughter I thought I knew. Where to now? Douglas Rose asked, her eyes finding mine. Home, Addie, I replied, the word feeling structurally sound for the first time in a year. Just home. I gripped her hand as we reached the bottom step, the metal of her wedding ring cold against my palm. We were bankrupt, we were scarred, and we were older, but a bridge doesn't just connect 2 points. It survives the weight of what passes over it. I didn't reach for my toolbox to fix a leak or a squeaky hinge. I reached for it because it was time to perform a controlled demolition on the memory of the woman who nearly buried us. A week had passed since the heavy thud of the gavel signaled the end of the trial. But standing in the foyer of our home in Matthews, I could still feel the stagnant energy of Lillian's betrayal clinging to the walls like soot. Rose stood beside me, her hand resting on the banister, her gaze fixed on the guest room door. That was the room Lillian had turned into her personal sanctuary, a space filled with items we now knew were bought with our own hijacked savings. Every time I look at that vanity, I see her practicing her signature. Douglas Rose said, her voice quiet but devoid of the old tremor. Then the vanity goes first, I replied, gripping the handle of my pry bar. We are reclaiming the square footage. As I began to disassemble the heavy oak piece, I found a floorboard Lillian had loosened near the corner. Taped to the underside was a spare key to the local safe deposit box I thought was secured. She had been planning one last sweep before the crash. The level of premeditated parasitism was breathtaking, yet I felt a strange clinical efficiency as I worked as if I were removing asbestos from a basement. Stripped, the room looked bigger without the lies. It looked honest. We spent the afternoon bagging up the remnants of her high society life. Her designer clothes, her abandoned sketchbooks, and the silk scarves were piled into black contractor bags. Rose found hidden credit card statements tucked deep in the closet, more paper trails of the long con. These silk scarves could pay for a month of groceries for a family at the shelter, Addie said, smoothing a piece of blue fabric. Better they do some good now. Pack them up, I said. I want this room empty by sunset. We worked in a rhythmic, dignified silence, stripping away the designer wallpaper she had insisted on, a cold, metallic gray that had always felt like a tomb. Underneath a loose drawer liner, Rose uncovered a box of old photos of us from 40 years ago that Lillian had hidden away. I realized then that she hadn't just wanted our money. She wanted to remove our history to make her new version of us easier to control. Painting over a mistake doesn't make it disappear, but it ensures you don't have to stare at the structural cracks every time you wake up. By evening, we had begun applying a fresh coat of warm, soft cream paint to the walls. The smell of fresh latex and hope slowly replaced the lingering scent of her expensive, cloying perfume. As the rollers covered the old marks on the drywall, the room began to transform from a monument of narcissism into a blank canvas for our future. It is amazing how much light a simple coat of paint can bring back into a house, Rose remarked, her face illuminated by the work lamp. It is not just the paint, Addie, I said, looking around the bare, clean space. It is the lack of shadows. I stood in the center of the empty room and realized that while the purge was done, the house still felt a little too quiet. And then Rose walked in, holding a seed catalog and a set of architectural sketches for a new greenhouse. She wasn't just fixing the house. She was planning to grow something new. The mail carrier had no idea he was delivering something that felt like a ghost when he slid the yellow envelope into our mailbox. But when I picked it up, the weight of it seemed far heavier than paper. I stood at the edge of the driveway, in the sharp December air, staring at the return stamp from the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction. It was 3 days before Christmas. I didn't bring the envelope inside. Instead, I walked straight toward my workshop behind the house. The clean scent of cedar sawdust from the greenhouse project greeted me as I opened the door. The smell was grounding a small barrier against whatever bitterness waited inside that prison letter. I sat down at my workbench and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 12 pages of lined prison stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably Lillian's sharp strokes, perfectly angled letters, the same confident script she had used on school papers and birthday cards decades ago. But the tone was different now. Each line carried a strange mixture of manufactured remorse and quiet entitlement. "Dear Daddy," the letter began. I almost laughed at the words. She hadn't called me that in 20 years. "I know you're hurting," she wrote, "but the real criminal here is the system." Page after page continued in the same voice. She described herself as a victim of a biased jury, an unfair investigation, and a husband too weak to stand by her side. Somewhere between the apologies and excuses, the true purpose of the letter finally surfaced. She wanted money. She wanted me to fund her appeal. Tucked neatly between the pages was an additional document, a pre-written statement she expected me to sign and submit to the parole board. It was framed as a declaration of forgiveness from a loving father. Even from a 6x9 prison cell, Lillian was still trying to rewrite reality. "You haven't changed at all," I murmured quietly to the empty workshop, "still selling the same rotten lumber." A few minutes later, the door creaked open behind me. Rose stepped inside. Her cane tapped lightly against the concrete floor as she crossed the room, the steady rhythm echoing softly through the workshop. When she saw the yellow envelope on the bench, she stopped. I held the pages out toward her. "Do you want to know what she said?" I asked gently. Rose didn't move forward. Instead, she folded her hands into the pockets of her cardigan and glanced toward the industrial shredder bolted to the edge of my workbench. "No," she said firmly. "I want to know what we're having for dinner." Her eyes settled briefly on the machine beside me. "Feed it to the blades, Douglas." The shredder roared to life. Grind. Whir. Then silence. 12 pages of manipulation vanished into thin strips of useless paper. We stood side by side, watching the machine chew through the last fragments of Lillian's demands until nothing recognizable remained. In that moment, something inside me shifted. By refusing to answer, by denying her even a single response, I had exercised the greatest power left to me. I had made her irrelevant. Christmas Eve arrived quietly that year, bringing with it a kind of peace we hadn't felt in a very long time. The house was simple, almost humble. There were no extravagant decorations, no designer centerpieces cluttering every table. Instead, we opened old boxes from the attic and hung mismatched ornaments we hadn't seen in years. Some were chipped, some were faded, but they were real. Basil joined us that evening for dinner. We served a simple pot roast, and the three of us sat around the table laughing about old stories from the hardware store. Stories about stubborn customers, broken tools, and mistakes that had nothing to do with courtrooms or bank accounts. First Christmas Eve in 10 years without a headache. Basil said, raising a glass of cider with a grin. That's because the poison's finally out of the well, I replied. The house felt different that night. Stronger. Like the foundation had finally settled after a long demolition. I looked across the table at Rose, the glow of the Christmas tree lights dancing across her face. For the first time since the accident, she smiled without effort. Not the tired smile of someone pretending to be strong. A real one. Later, as I began clearing the dishes from the table, a small, blinking light caught my attention from the hallway. The security monitor. I walked closer and studied the screen. A car sat parked at the far end of our driveway, its engine still running. The headlights cut through the darkness, bright and unblinking. Like two cold eyes watching the house. I stood on the front porch, my breath catching in the sharp January air, and realized something unsettling. The most dangerous threats don't always arrive with shattered glass and raised voices. Sometimes they come quietly carrying a clipboard and a carefully rehearsed smile. I didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, I reached for the porch light switch, letting the yellow glow spill across the driveway so I could clearly see whoever had been sitting there in the dark. The headlights of the idling sedan blinked off, and a woman stepped out. She looked harmless enough, late 30s, soft knit cardigan, a leather binder tucked neatly under her arm. Her posture carried the calm confidence of someone who believed she was delivering hope rather than disruption. "Mr. Harrow," she asked gently. "My name is Sarah Jenkins." She explained that she was a court-appointed social worker working with a state-funded restorative justice initiative. The binder she carried was filled with diagrams and pamphlets about healing conversations, reconciliation frameworks, and mediated dialogue between victims and offenders. "We believe that confronting the harm directly can create restorative outcomes for everyone involved," she said, her tone carefully balanced between sympathy and professional neutrality. Then she revealed the part that made my stomach tighten. Lillian herself had submitted the request. The proposal was simple: a mediated meeting, possibly a written exchange of letters. Eventually, if progress was made, a face-to-face conversation. The goal, Sarah explained, was to demonstrate accountability before Lillian's first parole review hearing, scheduled 10 years in the future. "My daughter didn't simply cause harm, Ms. Jenkins," I said slowly. My voice felt as cold as the frost gathering along the porch railing. "She engineered a structural collapse." Sarah remained calm, her pen poised above a notepad. "You don't restore a bridge that was designed to fail," I continued. "You clear the wreckage and build somewhere safer." The word restorative lingered in the air between us. It sounded gentle, almost noble, but I had spent my life studying structures, and I knew the difference between repair and removal. "You don't restore cancer," I added quietly. "You cut it out." The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches along the driveway. I stepped aside and motioned toward the door. "Come in before you freeze." Inside, the living room felt warm and steady. Rose joined us after a moment, moving carefully but confidently with her cane. She settled into her chair and listened, while Sarah outlined the program's process: mediated discussions, structured forgiveness, statements, guided emotional closure. Rose didn't interrupt. She simply listened. When Sarah finished, the room fell silent for several seconds. Then Rose spoke. "I spent 40 years being a mother," she said calmly. "I don't need a certificate from the state to know when something is finished." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. "Please inform the Department of Corrections that our boundary is permanent," she continued, "and it's built from reinforced concrete." Sarah nodded quietly and closed her binder. There was no argument, no pressure, only a polite understanding that some doors were meant to remain closed. I walked her back outside, the cold night air rushing in again as the front door opened. Each step across the porch felt strangely reassuring, as though the house behind me had grown stronger simply by refusing the invitation. After Sarah drove away, I locked the door and headed to my office. Jennifer Caldwell answered my call on the first ring. For the next hour, we reviewed the final reports from the liquidation of Lillian's design firm and the forced sale of her luxury condominium. Asset seizures, clawback actions, and insurance recoveries had been moving quietly through the courts for months. The final numbers were better than either of us expected. 80%, Douglas Jennifer said over the speakerphone. You recovered 80% of the original losses. That's almost unheard of in cases like this. It's not a miracle, I replied. It's a recovery. A bridge doesn't have to be perfect to carry weight. It only has to be strong enough. 80% will hold, I said. We can rebuild from that. Part of the recovered funds had come from an offshore account Lillian believed was impossible to trace. The forensic auditors had proven her wrong. The damage had been severe, but the foundation remained. When I closed the laptop, the numbers still glowed on the screen like a quiet promise. Across the room, Rose sat near the window, turning something small between her fingers. A silver key. I didn't recognize it. It didn't belong to any door in this house. She held it thoughtfully, the metal catching the lamplight, as she turned it over and over. Her expression held something complicated, part relief, part sorrow. I watched the light glint across the narrow teeth of that unfamiliar key, and I wondered how many more doors we would have to unlock before we were finally free. In 40 years of bridge inspection, I had learned that the smallest components, a single bolt, a hairline fracture, a silver key, are often the ones that determine if a structure stands or falls. I sat in our reclaimed living room, watching the winter light catch the jagged teeth of the small silver object Rose held. Where did this come from? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet house. Rose smiled, a soft, secret expression that reached her eyes. She revealed she had kept the key taped inside a 1950s cookbook Lillian frequently mocked for being outdated. Our daughter's arrogance was her own blind spot. She was so busy looking for digital treasures that she never bothered to check the physical history under her nose. Rose explained that the key belonged to a safety deposit box she had opened in secret years ago. It contained heirloom jewelry and gold coins Lillian never knew existed. I kept it for a rainy day, Douglas, she said, her fingers tracing the metal. I just didn't realize the rain would be a hurricane named Lillian. I felt a surge of awe. You were performing your own safety audit while I was looking at the clouds, I said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. We realized that while Lillian was looting our digital life, the physical foundation of our heritage remained safe under Rose's quiet watch. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, a final update from Jennifer Caldwell regarding Beckett Shepard's sentencing. Because he had cooperated and provided the recordings that buried Lillian, the judge handed him a reduced sentence. 10 years. Long enough for a man to think about every bolt he didn't tighten. I felt a clinical sense of closure. The man who enabled the rot was finally accounted for, leaving no loose ends in the structural integrity of our new life. Let him go, I told Jennifer. He was just a secondary support that failed under pressure. He is irrelevant now. Rose then led me into the new hobby room, the smell of fresh cream paint still faint in the air. She unveiled her final project, using a portion of the recovered 80% of our savings to fund the Rose Harrow Community Library. She showed me the architectural sketches for the renovated space, a place built for truth stories and community. A library, Addie, that is a legacy that actually matters, I said, my heart swelling. A library is a bridge made of paper and ink. It carries people to places they never thought they could reach. It is a structure built to last, Douglas, she replied, her hand finding mine. Just like us. I looked at the plans and felt a profound sense of peace. The project would be housed in the very downtown building Lillian had once tried to buy for her firm's expansion, a final poetic reclamation of the land she tried to steal. I performed a mental safety audit of our current state. I looked for cracks, for rot, for vulnerabilities, and for the first time in my life I found none. I looked at the blueprints for the library, And then back at my wife realization, dawning on me like a sunrise over a newly finished span. We weren't just surviving the collapse. We were the architects of something that would stand long after we were gone. The structure was sound. The cables were tight, and the view from the top was clearer than I ever imagined possible. I stood on the front porch of our house, the morning air, crisp and clean, and performed one last silent inspection. The air in North Carolina on New Year's Eve carries a specific weight, not just the cold, but the heavy, lingering scent of wood smoke and the quiet promise of a slate being scrubbed clean by the frost. I looked at the driveway, remembering the car I'd seen idling there before Christmas. It hadn't been a ghost or a threat, but Basil Redmond. He had left a package on the porch, a framed photo of the original bridge blueprints I drew 40 years ago. It was a return to my true self, a reminder that I was built to create things that lasted, not just to watch them fall. I walked back inside and joined Rose on the back deck. We sat in cedar Adirondack chairs, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, watching the first frost settle on the yard. We looked out over the area where the new greenhouse would soon stand, discussing the quietude of our reclaimed life. I realized that the most resilient bridges aren't the ones that never crack, but the ones that are rebuilt with better materials after a total collapse. We survived the stress test, Addie, I said, reaching out to take her hand. The load is finally gone. She squeezed my fingers, looking up at the sky. I don't think I've ever seen the stars look this sharp, Douglas. Or maybe I'm just finally looking up instead of at my feet. 0. That's the amount of leverage she has left. A perfect, beautiful circle of nothing. At 11:45 p.m., my phone vibrated in my pocket, a final automated notification of a rejected call from the correctional facility. It was the last ghost of the year trying to find a way back into the house. I looked at the screen, seeing the familiar sequence of numbers, and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no pity, just the clinical observation of a dead signal. Still calling even at the end of the world, I remarked. Rose didn't even look over. Let it ring out into the cold Douglas. There is no one here to pick up anymore. Time is the ultimate inspector. It wears down the weak and polishes the strong until only the truth is left standing in the morning light. The clock struck midnight in the distance, signaled by a few stray fireworks from the neighbors that blossomed like fireflowers over the tree line. I took my phone, navigated to the settings, and permanently deactivated the line associated with the jail calls, effectively cutting the last digital wire. I found a final unread text from Beckett Shepard, sent from his processing center. She never deserved you. I deleted it without a second thought. Silence was the only power I needed now. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and we shared a quiet toast, looking toward the dark yard, where the library blueprints would soon become a reality in the spring sunshine. Happy New Year, Addie. The audit is complete. To the new year, Douglas, she replied, her eyes reflecting the porch light. To a house that finally stands on its own. I slid the phone into my pocket, the screen dark and the connection severed forever. I looked at Rose, took her hand, and walked back into the house, closing the door on the past, with the steady, certain click of a lock that was finally truly secure. Looking back on this family story, I realized my greatest mistake wasn't missing the forged signatures. It was ignoring the small cracks that had already begun forming inside my own home. I spent 40 years inspecting bridges, searching for rust in steel and fractures in concrete. Yet I never stopped to inspect character with the same discipline. This family story taught me a painful truth. Love without accountability can slowly turn into blindness. When we excuse every warning sign in the name of love, we quietly allow damage to grow. Don't make the same mistake I did. Silence is not peace, and generosity is not the same as good parenting. When something feels wrong, document it, confront it. Truth may hurt for a moment, but denial can destroy an entire life. Many people have called what happened here an act of revenge. Some even describe it as one of those dramatic grandpa stories where an older man finally fights back. But if I am honest, what some people call revenge was never about punishment. It was about protection. It was the moment I stopped being naive and finally chose responsibility. In this family story, I learned that boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are structure, the same kind of structure that keeps a bridge from collapsing. Real strength is not in anger. Real strength is in choosing justice over fear. And despite everything that happened, I will admit something difficult. No father ever dreams of standing in a courtroom across from his own child. If there is one lesson I carry forward from this journey, it is this: integrity must be inspected, just like finances or engineering. Trust people, but always verify what stands beneath the surface. Many grandpa stories speak about wisdom earned through time, but wisdom often comes from mistakes we wish we had caught earlier. When everything collapsed around us, I believe God allowed the truth to surface, not to destroy our lives, but to rebuild them stronger. Faith did not remove the storm. Instead, it steadied my hands while I rebuilt after this family story fell apart. Thank you for walking this road with me until the end. Stories like this are why people continue sharing grandpa stories, not to celebrate pain, but to remind us that survival and rebuilding are always possible. If you were in Douglas's position, what would you have done? I would truly like to hear your thoughts. And if this story stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future journeys. Please remember that while this narrative reflects real-world themes of betrayal and financial exploitation, certain details were dramatized to strengthen the message.